She is one of the youngest heads of state, and I must say, one of the most committed, effective, articulate, and inspiring women on the world stage today. She was elected president of her country in 2021. Only interesting that this happened. Kosovo's a very young country. And in that time, they've had 2 female presidents, including our honored speaker today. Now, if we followed that model for the world, we would be in a better place. And maybe the United States will get there one of these days. The president is a lawyer and a very good lawyer at that. It's not surprising that when it came to defend Kosovo's independence in the International Court of Justice, she was the lead defender. And she understands the horrors of war, the pain of war. She lived through the brutal campaign of terror led by Milosevic, the former Yugoslav president. The effort that he made to move the majority Albanian population out of its country, out of Kosovo, is really one of the horrible blots, I think, in the world today, and there are so many forces of evil. She is deeply committed to democracy. She is deeply committed to guarding it and to fighting authoritarians, because as the leader of a relatively new democracy and as someone who had to champion its independence, it is perfectly understandable that she would stay the course and be as strong as she has been. This past April, she held the 2nd annual Global Conference on Women, Peace, and Security. And I can tell you, having been there, that it was just an extraordinary event, much commitment to battling the horrors of conflict-related sexual violence, but she also put climate on the agenda, because that too is an increasing cause and will be an increasing cause of conflict in our world. Her country has been one of the few in the world providing reparations to the survivors of sexual violence. And I think given that period in which rapes against women and men as well was so prevalent and so horrific, it is a tribute to Kosovo that they have grappled and continue to grapple with this problem, which certainly is happening around the world as well, regrettably now in Ukraine, for example. In short, I would say she's an extraordinary leader. She's a committed Democrat with a small d. She is a champion for women and girls. Please join me in welcoming Madam President. So I know you're so interested in hearing her, and she can relate to so much of what you are going through in your own countries. President Osmani, you have been working to build and sustain your democracy since it became independent in 2008. It would be interesting, I think, for us to hear what it's been like for you as a leader, and a female leader at that, both what it takes to continue that struggle, but also wondering if you have any particular perspectives and strategies to promote democracy in this time when we're seeing the erosion of democracy at the hands of authoritarians.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador, to begin with, for your very kind words. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I've heard about the amazing work of Vital Voices for years. I feel so privileged and honored to join you here today. Well, the story of Kosovo is one of resilience, and it's a story of a country that has been built from the ashes, of a people that had to endure so much, so that oftentimes it's hard to explain because it's been centuries of occupation and violence against the people of Kosovo. But the bottom line is this: our kids are the very first generation in our history that are living in peace. The very first generation ever. Our, great parents lived through a war. Our great parents went through a war. Our, parents went through a war. We went through a horrendous war. Our children are the very first generation that are living in a democracy. So I would say, to answer your question, Ambassador, the resilience was built because we've known the opposite of democracy. We've gone through the opposite of democracy. We've seen the destruction, that authoritarianism, that, war criminals, that leaders who actually deep inside are simply psychopaths who want to kill others for the sake of being different, and authoritarians who just want to grasp other territories because they can, because they feel more powerful, because they have more weapons, and who believe that they can commit genocide against the people, as well as war crimes and crimes against humanity. Unfortunately, around the world, we still have many of those. They have made, in the case of Kosovo, Milosevic have made our people go through so much that now we know what it is to live in the opposite of democracy. So we never take democracy as a given. We never take freedom as a given. We never take, individual human rights as a given. For us, growing up, and practically for everyone that you meet from Kosovo, so everyone that you will meet here today, including Mimosa, who's been a part of you for years, our right to education was, violated. We were not allowed to go to school. So today, when I send my kids to school, it's not just sending my kids to school, it's the essence of democracy. It's the essence of freedom. Because I was 7 years old when I was attacked by police officers, by Milosevic police officers, just because I was holding a book. So it's not just going to school, it's not just like every day, it's living democracy. And that's why we're committed to paying any price to defend it and to make sure that it succeeds with all of its flaws. Because we do have to understand that, of course, it's not a perfect system. Now, the second thing is, but it's the best that we have, as we've heard it so far. The second thing is when it comes to fighting authoritarianism. Now, again, it comes from experience. We've seen how it works, and we recognize an autocrat when we see one. For us, because we've learned it the hard way. We've learned it the hard way. So it didn't really, in Kosovo, it was so evident with everyone you would talk that Putin was about to invade Ukraine. We kept being told, no, it's not going to happen, he would never do it. But that's the rational way of thinking about things. Autocrats don't think rationally. You can't have rational conversations with them. You can say that, when Milosevic waged wars over, all over Yugoslavia and caused more than 150,000 civilian deaths, you can say that he was thinking about a rational plan. So the point is, we recognize autocratic behavior at the very beginning. So we're very resilient in making sure that we defend democratic values. But as it is with every other, I would say, battle, defending democracy is not a battle that you can fight alone. Because no matter how successful you are inside of your territory, inside of your country, it really depends a lot on what's going on around your neighborhood. Unfortunately, we still have a neighbor that, Serbia in our case, that acts in an authoritarian way, not just towards their people, but also towards the neighbors. So we still struggle with a lot of, destabilizing effects of the fact that we have an authoritarian neighbor. who wants to fight peace, who wants to fight stability, who wants to fight the hard-won freedoms that we've achieved together with our allies. And for that reason, we have to be very vigilant, we have to be very careful, and we need to make sure that we don't let authoritarian leaders take us back in the past, but we only make steps forward. Now, how we've managed to defend these values in the past 16 years of independence. One, I would say, very resilient and democratic institutions. Kosovo has the strongest electoral democracy, not just in our region, but also beyond. One of the greatest examples of how democracy works. We always have a very smooth transition of power, no matter the huge changes that happen in our institutions. And and secondly, we have a very strong civil society. But the work that the civil society has done, including in the 90s, when we were occupied by Milosevic, and the work that they've done right after freedom and independence has been instrumental in making and keeping our democracy strong and fighting even the tiniest autocratic tendency. The third, I would say, the role of media. Despite the fact that we're living in the age of disinformation and propaganda, it has always been important that whenever democracy was in danger or was being challenged, that we had important voices in the media fighting to restore it, fighting to make sure that it's kept, strong. And finally, and most importantly, the women. The women in our country. The women led the change in the 90s. The women led the change right after the war. The women led the peace negotiations. The women led the fight to build strong institutions. And the women today lead the women peace and security agenda. Unfortunately, the women were kept as the unsung heroes. No matter their role in our, fighting for our freedom as freedom fighters, no matter their role in building institutions, no matter the fact that women really even did the toughest work right after the war, making sure that they were engaged in reconciliation. I'm talking about women such as our former Minister of Justice, our late Minister of Justice, who lost her entire family during the war. Her husband and her children were executed, but she was the one leading the fight for reconciliation and the return of Serbs into Kosovo, making sure that despite of her pain, she brings people together. So it was one of the toughest things to do right after the war. But she did it because we want to make sure that no one ever goes through what we had to go through. So again, it's been a very, very painful road. But when you go through so much, and when you understand that there's nothing that can stand in the way of a people that fights for its freedom, then, of course, you learn a lot from that very difficult path. And it makes you so resilient, but also grateful. Grateful for the freedoms you have, and also grateful for the alliances you have. Because we were not alone in our fight. The world did not stand still or close their eyes to our suffering. Quite the opposite. The democracies of the world came to our rescue and saved our lives. And as I often say, if there is one example in the world that is a testament to what democracies can achieve when they stand together, that example is Kosovo. So, it was a long answer to your question.
No, it was an important answer, and I was sitting here thinking about so many of our vital voices here in the room, because as I look at you, I know what pain and agony many of you have been going through in terms of trying to move your countries in a better direction. So I'm sure what you said resonated. No other than Kamala Harris has said that the status of women is the status of democracy. And where you don't have gender equality, where you do have women increasingly marginalized, you can't possibly have a robust democracy. And we know that authoritarians seem to target women, knowing that women's leadership is absolutely critical to undermining what they represent. Can you speak to that a little bit about the critical nature of women's participation? You touched at that on the end, but.
First of all, I definitely agree. I think one of the most important features that one needs to look at when defining an authoritarian or identifying one is how they treat women in a society. It has always been like that historically, and simply we need to learn from history. And second is dehumanizing others, and especially women. So now, how have we made sure that we fight these tendencies? We need to make sure that we have proper legislation in force in a country. So one of the things that has really helped us fight these tendencies has been our constitution and our laws. We've built them very, very early on, and one of the champions to help us do that was Secretary Albright. She came all the way to Kosovo to help us build legislation, make sure that we have legislative quotas in place, which I believe has been one of the strongest instruments to give a voice to women. And now, of course, women are elected in the parliament without the help of quotas. But at the very beginning, when you traditionally have a very patriarchal society where women are seen as someone that needs to stay outside of the room and simply execute what men in the political parties agree on, the legislative quota has been, I would say, instrumental in making sure that women have a voice in the parliament and then in the political scene, in the political life in general. Secondly, we've made sure that we, all of us women that have been in politics for a long time, but also women in civil society, that we work together cross-party and cross-ethnic lines. And that has made the difference. Because we've had many cases when, let's say, men in all political parties, because they get together, no matter their differences, if it's about fighting women participation, they always get together. They find a way to get together. That makes them together, no matter their differences. But we've learned from that, because so I was elected to parliament 5 times, and when we were sitting in the parliament and we would see these tendencies to remove the legislative quota, we got together too, no matter the party line and no matter the ethnic, or the nationality of the women in the parliament. We got together to defend our achievements. Because the problem is, once you have an achievement when it comes to women participation or gender equality in general, it doesn't mean that it will stay that way. There are always tendencies to get you back, to make steps, backwards. So we have to be very vigilant on defending what we have achieved, while at the same time we have to make sure that once we are in a certain position, we use it to deal with the most acute problems that women face in our societies. Because yes, we have a lot of achievements in political life, but that doesn't mean that we don't have domestic violence. That doesn't mean that there's no discrimination in the workplace. That doesn't mean that we still don't have a long way to go when it comes to, women in economy, making sure that they are empowered, also in terms of property and so on. So yes, strong legislation, but also women who continue to fight in the institutions all the time to make sure that if there is, a tendency within the country, but at the same time, if there are autocratic forces who try to fight your democracy from outside, as we do, because our biggest challenge actually comes from outside. It comes from our neighbor. And it's not just a security challenge, because when you constantly have security challenges at your border, you're not going to be able to deal with so many of the democratic or economic reforms within the country. Because all the time you have to deal with security challenges. So by fighting you in terms of security, they also fight your democracy. But of course, you need to make sure that you never, as I said, you never believe that, okay, we've achieved that, that's enough, so let's just stay in peace. No, it's an everyday fight to make sure that you sustain these achievements. And of course, always strive for more, because the beauty of democracy is that it's never, you can never say, okay, it's perfect, I've achieved everything. You always strive for more. You always know that you can achieve more. There's never like a full stop. And just understanding that and continuing the fight in the parliament, in the government, in the institutions and all the way work with civil society has been the key to fighting autocratic tendencies, whether within the country, although we haven't had that many of those, but mostly the ones that come from outside. And just an example, Kosovo has been the very first country in the region to adopt sanctions against Russia. And of course, sanctions against Iran, because of the way how they treat women, and all of these, forces of evil and malign forces around the world. We know that we're a small country, but we need to set an example. We need to show where we stand for, because I strongly believe that a power, an impact of a country is not determined by its sheer size, but the story it has to tell. The story it has to tell. And no matter... And the story of Kosovo has been a story of resilient women. A story of resilient women who, despite of the challenges inside the country and despite of the challenges that came from outside of the country, they never gave up on achieving freedom and defending freedom, and never just for ourselves, but making sure that we never stop speaking up for women around the world. Many people, men, were asking, why do you keep giving all of these interviews about Afghanistan? Well, I spoke all around the world. I gave countless interviews in the United States, all the way to India, about why it matters to not give up on the rights of women in Afghanistan or the women in Iran, or about what's going on in Ukraine. We never stop speaking, and we showcase the case of Kosovo, just so that they understand why it matters, because when you fight for the people who need you most, when you give them a helping hand, you will gain a friend, a partner, and an ally for life. So when President Biden called us and he said, "It's my personal ask that you help Afghan evacuees," the very first leader in the world that responded positively was me, the president of Kosovo. In 15 minutes, we said, we want to receive Afghan evacuees because we've been refugees ourselves. 80% of the people of Kosovo were kicked out of their houses. We know what it means to be a refugee. We know what it means to be forced to leave your home. So we wanted to make sure that those children, the same way that I was a child of war, when they get a safe haven, they know that they're not just safe, but they're appreciated. They're appreciated. Because, being a refugee and the time that you spend as a refugee or as an IDP, an internally displaced person, it shapes you for the rest of your life. It shapes you for the rest of your life. And you never give up on helping others. You're always there in helping others. And because the hearts and the doors of the people of the world were open to us all the way to Australia, we now have a chance to give back. So we were the very first country in the world to say, yes, we want to give back. We want Afghan evacuees to come to Kosovo and not just feel safe, but also thrive. We made sure that the kids have the kind of education that they need. And the women have the kind of support that we need. When the war in Ukraine broke out, of course, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, we said we're ready to accept refugees, and today we are the country with the most successful journalist in residence program, because we have journalists from Ukraine coming and working in Kosovo and defending the truth, because that's one of the most important things that we have to do in fighting against authoritarianism as well. So again, yes, you might be a small country, but you can give great examples through great deeds that have an impact in the world. And that's what we've been trying to do.
So whether you're a small country or you're individuals like yourselves, the lesson is there. And Madam President, you talk about resilience, and I know you became very interested in politics at a young age, and in fact were active for those years that a teenager could be active. And we have women in this room who have run for high office. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into politics, what it takes. Because, as you said, you've had 5 mandates in the parliament, you rose to speaker, now you're the president. Give us a sense of both the challenges, but why it matters and why you became so involved.
When I was a little girl, it was early 90s, and we had our movement for independence. My dad was part of it, just, not a high-level activist, but just an activist like most people of Kosovo. And they used to have these meetings in our living room when it was all men. All men. I was a little girl, but I would enter that room, and I would listen to every single meeting. So just a little girl and a bunch of men in a room where they would talk about a lot of complex things, because, being politically active under Milosevic meant that you could be killed any time. And then I lived through the horrors of having, my dad arrested. He was a political prisoner and tortured, and just seeing that as a very young kid, having police forces breaking down the door and forcibly arresting your father and using violence against the rest of the family, and just, taking your books. I was very connected to my books as a kid. It was like, for me,
You can tell.
For me, it was our education was the way to get to freedom. And, one of the police officers just took one of my books. It was called Historia Skanderbeg, the history of Skanderbeg, the history of our national hero. And he started burning it down in front of my eyes, and he said, "You shouldn't read this." And it's, things like this that shape you, and you understand that even as a very young activist, you have to do something. So right after we became a free country in 1999, I was a teenager yet, but I said, I need to do something. Everyone needs to do something. So I got involved in the youth forums of my party, and this is how it started. And many people think, oh, you were elected president at 38. At that time, I was the youngest head of state when I was elected. And it feels like it happened, overnight. No, it didn't happen overnight. It took me more than 20 years to become president. And that's the first thing that I hope many people, especially young people, understand. It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of not giving up, and many, many, many years of work. It takes consistency. It takes consistency and trust building. And it takes direct connections with the people. I've been a very grassroots kind of politician. I went from door to door, not just on election time, every single day, every single weekend. And when you do that for more than 2 decades, when you keep the promises that you've given to the people, even if it means giving up on everything that you've achieved, for the sake of keeping the promises, it doesn't go unnoticed. It doesn't go unnoticed. So I would say consistency, hard work, not giving up, no matter, oftentimes it involves also political violence. It involves the kind of very, very dirty propaganda that is used only against women politicians. And it's continuing even as we speak. But just, making sure that even those who fight the more they fight you, the more resilient you become. The more they fight you, the more they instill in me the spirit of not giving up. And just making sure that every single time you feel like giving up, you think of all those little girls who are watching. And they hope that you don't. Because we all stand in the shoulders of giants. So many women before us have removed so many huge rocks from our way. There are still many left, but we need to make sure that we remove the ones that are on the road so that our daughters and their daughters have a much easier way. But I would say it really takes time. I started as an intern, and then I moved on to an admin assistant, and then to an advisor, and then to a special advisor, and then to chief of staff, and then to a member of parliament once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and then to speaker of parliament, and only then as a president. So experience really teaches you a lot, just making sure that, you don't have high expectations that things happen overnight, but it will take a lot of hard work, and it's going to be that long journey that's going to prepare you for the really tough work of leading your country and leading the rise. So, you already know all of this. so I don't need to tell you that. But it's understanding that it's not going to be easy, but it is absolutely a fight worth fighting for.
You know, one of the enemies in a conversation like this is the clock. And it has just shown itself over and over here on the screen. It says time is up, and I have about 30 other questions. But what I said at the outset, I think you now know why I said it. She is resilient, courageous, committed, articulate, inspirational.
Thank you
Please
so
join
much.
me in thanking her.